We're going to finish up our discussion of Othello by discussing the character Iago. Now, in my opinion, I saved the best for last. There are many, many reasons that Othello is my favorite Shakespearean tragedy, but Iago is definitely one of them. I think he's the best, or worst, villain ever, and I think Kenneth Branagh's portrayal of him in the 1995 film version that we watched is dead on. As I mentioned when we discussed Othello's character, one of the remarkable things about Shakespeare that makes his play so great, even after 400 years, is that he has such insight into human nature. He created characters that are almost ideal matches for some mental illnesses, and psychology wasn't even established as a discipline until over 300 years after he wrote. We're going to look at how Iago fits the description of a psychopath, even though that term and that cluster of symptoms hadn't been defined. I think it's pretty cool. The source for this presentation is literary critic Fred West. As I said, writing about 3 centuries before the fields of psychology and sociology were even dreamt of, Shakespeare created characters with personality traits that have been confirmed by modern psychology. Iago in Othello is an excellent example of a personality disorder that's been identified as psychopathology, sociopathy, or antisocial personality disorder. These 3 terms are often used interchangeably, but technically, psychopathology results from inborn physical conditions, possibly including genetics. Sociopathy has the same symptoms, but it's believed to result from environmental influences in our youth. Because it's often difficult to determine whether symptoms result from physical or environmental conditions, the illness is now referred to in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as antisocial personality disorder, a term that encompasses both psychopathology and sociopathy. For the purposes of this discussion, we're going to refer to that mental illness as psychopathology. Before we begin discussing Iago and psychopathology, it's important to address a widespread misconception. We usually hear about psychopathology in terms of psychopathic killers, but most psychopaths aren't killers or even violent. The most common traits of the illness are a lack of conscience and a method of interacting with others that's characterized by almost constant manipulation. Often, these traits contribute to the success that people experience in areas like politics and business. In fact, many recent studies have indicated a really high percentage of psychopaths among American CEOs. According to literary critic Fred West, Iago is characterized by a number of traits that have been associated with a psychopath. Although advancements in psychology have led to refinements and additions, as demonstrated in the graphic to the left, the basic characteristics of a psychopath were detailed in a 1941 landmark study by Hervey Cleckley, which West uses in his analysis of Iago as a psychopath. Okay, let's look at some of the major symptoms of psychopathology that were identified by Cleckley and have been confirmed by more recent studies, and see how Iago demonstrates them. According to Cleckley, as West tells us, as well as most modern psychology experts, one trait of a psychopath is a lack of motivation for his or her actions. Psychopaths will commit crimes that are very high risk for very little reward and often with little or no apparent goal. West states that Iago's actions in Othello lack sufficient motivation and, in fact, have no motivation in a mature sense, but are instead the whims of a child. Now, Iago does state motives, but they change depending on the circumstances, as Wells points out. He tells Rodrigo that he wants to destroy Othello because Othello has promoted Cassio instead of him. He also states at different times that he loves Desdemona, and that he suspects that Othello has slept with his wife, Emilia. But West says these comments are afterthoughts and excuses, not real motivations. Iago simply hunts for a motivation when he feels pressed to provide one, and uses whatever is most convenient at the time and best fits the context of his comments, according to West. West adds that after making these excuses, Iago then goes on to believe them himself. In addition, Cleckley states, and modern psychology confirms, that many, if not most psychopaths are undetectable because they fit in so well with the people around them. They even seem particularly friendly, warm, compassionate, and honest, although they actually possess none of those traits. In fact, they're often particularly charming. Iago is very good at fitting in and even at convincing others that he is a supporter of theirs, if not their friend. Certainly he appears to love Othello. He also appears to be Cassio's good friend every time he interacts with him. She even appears to be sympathetic towards Desdemona when Othello's jealousy leads her to distress. In fact, he's so well liked, admired, and trusted that virtually everyone refers to him as Honest Iago. As West points out, no one suspects him of lying until the final scene, and then even his own wife is astounded to find out the depths of his dishonesty and depravity. The charming, supportive personality that Iago creates for the people around him is obviously a deception. One reason psychopaths are so good at lying and deception, according to Cleckley, is that they have no conscience or moral sense. They don't approach lies or any other action with the sense of guilt that others do, West explains. According to West, Iago is entirely uninterested in any moral consequences of his actions. Even in the final scene, in which his plot and lies have been largely discovered, he shows no remorse. Instead, he retreats behind a wall of silence that he says will never be broken. It's very unlikely that Iago felt any remorse for his actions because, according to Cleckley, psychopaths don't feel anything very strongly. Cleckley states, and recent studies confirm, that psychopaths usually do a great job of pretending to have the same feelings that others have, but they've learned how to act as if they have strong feelings as opposed to actually having them. As Iago works his plot against Othello, he appears to hold him in very high regard and even love him. He claims to be worried when Othello is disturbed by jealousy. On the other hand, he tells Roderigo that he hates Othello. But according to West, chances are that he feels neither love nor hate. In fact, he probably feels very little, if anything at all. In fact, if there's a true motivation for Iago's behavior in the play, it's probably tied to his lack of emotions, West states. People don't become psychopaths as adults. They're psychopaths from birth or very early childhood. Iago obviously has managed to live his life without creating major problems, which is why he's lived so long without the truth about his personality being uncovered. Now, West maintains that the reason he can't go on doing this is because psychopaths need strong stimuli to feel anything at all. And during this time of peace, Iago has lacked that stimuli. Iago's a professional soldier, as West points out. The danger and thrill of killing supplied on the battlefield are usually probably enough stimuli to raise some emotional response in Iago, West says. But we know that Othello's troops have been off the battlefield for some time at the beginning of the play. We know that because Othello's had ample time to visit Brabantio and intrigue him with his war stories. Even beyond that, he's had enough time to fall in love with Desdemona to the point that this older confirmed bachelor decides to marry her. The anticipated battle with the Turks on Cyprus then doesn't materialize. Now, as West points out, this peaceful existence lacks the strong stimuli needed to elicit any emotional response from a psychopath. So Iago creates his own excitement by carrying out a complex layered plot against Othello just so he can feel something. Finally, although West doesn't discuss it, another character trait of psychopaths is their constant manipulation of others. Very few psychopaths seek treatment for their illness because, as Cleckley points out, and West tells us, they see nothing wrong with themselves or what they do. But it's very difficult to treat psychopaths even if they do seek help. Generally, all psychologists can do is get a psychopath to promise not to manipulate anyone that day. But many psychopaths are incapable of having any interaction with others that isn't completely manipulative. Iago's obviously a practiced manipulator. In fact, he doesn't have a single interaction with any character in the play that's not a manipulation. He convinces Othello, Desdemona, Cassio, and Roderigo that he's a good friend, and he manipulates them to behave any way he wants them to. He lies to virtually everyone, and the lies he tells Roderigo, for example, are the opposite of the lies that he tells Othello. But with the skill of the consummate manipulator, Iago never forgets which lies he's told which people, and he never confuses his audience, as the partner does in the Canterbury Tales. His lies and games are uncovered not because he confuses which lies he has told which people, but because Cassio isn't killed, and Othello then uses the handkerchief as proof of Desdemona's infidelity in Emilia's presence. Well, Emilia knows what actually happened with the handkerchief, and that's what leads to the collapse of Iago's house of cards. In fact, it might even be argued that the reason that Iago says he'll never speak again at the end of the play is that everyone knows by then that he's a manipulator. Manipulations only work if people don't think that they're being manipulated. Since everyone knows Iago is a manipulator at the end of the play, and he can't talk to anyone without manipulating them, there's no reason for him to ever speak again. Iago demonstrates all of the most serious basic traits of a psychopath, and it's an indication of Shakespeare's insight into human nature that he was able to create such an excellent textbook example of a man with an illness that wouldn't be defined for over 300 years. Iago remains one of the greatest villains in fiction, and one who continues to intrigue us because he exemplifies a particular type of person. His evil is deep, but realistic, and his depiction is one of the factors that places Othello among the greatest works in world literature. Okay, I think that gives us some background in psychopathology and how Iago demonstrates most of the major symptoms of that mental illness. I really hope this discussion enhances your understanding and enjoyment of the play because Iago is a fantastically written villain. But if you have any questions, you know you can email me from an account other than Canvas at deborah.oakey@csn.edu. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is to respond to the discussion boards, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you have to say about the play Othello.